Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I'm very delighted to see so many of you here today. I saw there are so many attendees, and I really look forward to meeting you in future conversations and hopefully perhaps at the conferences soon. So let me introduce myself. My name is Stella Gu. I am the primary representative for TigerMed business in Switzerland and in Europe. I am working here in Zug in Switzerland. So first of all, thank you so much for joining the TigerMed webinar on including China in your clinical development strategies. So I work for TigerMed. So at TigerMed, we take pride in providing our clients with insights into clinical development that could facilitate accelerated drug development. We are so proud to be hosting these webinars that we can share our knowledge that eventually will help your clinical trial projects and answer the unmet medical needs. So you are all experts. So most of us already know the importance and the size of the Chinese market. It's large patient population base, which leads to a relatively rapid recruitment. The regulatory reform over the past few years that positively influenced the China's position in clinical research. Those are all positive, but there are also a lot of challenges, many of you already know, and challenges and hurdles to be addressed. These facts may cause significant impact in your clinical development. So today, our speaker, Dr. Jianzong Yang, will share with you our experiences in planning and conducting clinical trials in China. So let me introduce Dr. Jianzong Yang. Jianzong is CSO, Chief Science Officer of TigerMed, the largest clinical CRO in China, which TigerMed has over 15 years of experience in pharmaceutical and biotech industry clinical research. Jianzong is also the founder and CEO of Mozim, which is now also a TigerMed company. And before that, he was the director of clinical pharmacology at GSK. So Jianzong will bring a lot of experience today to the table, and we invite you to ask him any questions. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box here in the bottom. And with saying that, I hand it over to Jianzong.
Thank you, Stella.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So like Stella said, today I'm going to talk about including China into a global drug development strategy. This is the outline of my presentation. I'll start with why, but the focus of today's presentation is on when and how. I'm going to illustrate that using a few case studies. So I'll start with why we should consider including China into a global drug development plan. The number one reason is the large pharmaceutical market in China. Since year 2018, China has surpassed Japan and the EU and become the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world. But in contrast, China's new drug development is still lagging behind. You can see on the bottom right corner, this number is a bit outdated, but just to give you some idea, between year 2011 and the year 2017, altogether 220 drugs were approved worldwide. In the US, you can see 192 drugs were launched. And so is in Germany, over 150 drugs were launched. But in China, the number is quite small, just 17. That accounts for only 8% of this total number of 220. The second reason being the large population, and we know that China has a base population of over 1.4 billion. As a result of that, you can see the large patient population and huge unmet medical need. You can, if we take cancer mortality as an example, every 10 minutes, 55 people die from cancer, 8 from gastric cancer, 13 from lung cancer, and 7 from hepatocellular carcinoma. That's death number in every 10 minutes. The third reason is quite more recent phenomena. Many of you probably have been aware of that. In the recent 5 years or so, the number of biotech companies have surged in China. And those biotech companies are assets hungry. To start with their pipeline, they needed to collaborate with global companies. So you can see a few examples on the top left corner. Probably the graph on the left bottom corner is more evident. Since year 2016, 2017, the number of in-license deal to China market, there's a big number surge since the year 2017. I just give you a very recent example. We know that at the end of last month, May the 28th, the US FDA approved the first KRAS inhibitor from Amgen, I think. And just a few days later, on June the 1st, there's an announcement from Mirati and Shanghai-based Zai Lab. They entered into a collaboration to develop Mirati's KRAS inhibitor, adagrasib, and that the rights in Greater China has been issued to Zai Lab. Here I highlighted the payments. These numbers are quite striking. Mirati will receive the front payment of $65 million with the potential to receive additional $273 million in development, plus later on for the royalties for annual net sales. So these reasons are why China market, or considering including China into global development, is so attractive. However, many of us are worried about entering into the China market. For example, the transparency in drug approval. I can say that over the past 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, there's a great improvement in regulatory environment. You can see that in year 2016, China FDA, now it is called NMPA, joined the ICH. And since then, they issued a number of regulatory guidelines. I just listed a few of them. The goals for these guidelines are quite clear. That includes to improve the quality. Here, quality means not only the quality for the drug, but also for the clinical study quality, and to streamline the review and approval process, to encourage innovation so that China can close the gap from other countries for unmet medical needs. So like I said, I'm going to focus on when and how using a few case studies. But before that, a simple illustration for this so-called drug lag. which refers to time passes between the new drug approval in the US or Europe, and a few years later, China gets the drug is approved in China. So this time delay is so-called drug lag. And typically, before the regulatory reform I mentioned earlier, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, this drug lag can be somewhere between 5 to 8 years. The main reasons being the slow review process and some of the additional local requirements like PK bridging studies, which I'm going to talk about in more details later on. But we all know the concept of ICH E5, which was facilitated by countries like Japan, because in essence, ICH E5 is for bridging studies to facilitate the registration of medicines among ICH regions by looking into the potential ethic factors, particularly to look whether the same dose in Western countries applies to Japan or other countries. So this slide can better illustrate the purpose of ICH E5, essentially the concept of bridging studies. If we have a drug that is already approved in Europe or US, or it is already in a late phase clinical trial, how can we facilitate the drug development in other countries, such as Japan and China? So we can look at the potential difference or similarity in these 4 areas: medical practice, PK exposure, safety, and efficacy. If there's no big difference, then we can apply the data from Europe or US to these other new areas. So based on the idea of bridging studies, there are different scenarios. The first scenario, as illustrated on top, is quite rare, and that only applies to some of the drugs that have a huge unmet medical need, because that means in this case, the drug is already approved in the US or Europe, and and China or Japan only conducts a PK bridging study to get drug approval. So it is quite rare. The second scenario is more common, particularly I think when I was working in GSK 7 years ago or 10 years ago, this is a quite common practice in China for global companies to enter into the China market, because in many cases, the drug is already got approved in the US or Europe, or many of them are already in the late phase clinical trials. So it is very hard for China to join the global phase 3 study. As a result of that, we can conduct a PK or sometimes a PK/PD bridging study so that China can conduct its own phase 3 study. But because this starting of the phase 3 study is already lagging behind, there's often 2 or 3 years delay for China to obtain the NDA. Now, the third scenario is getting more and more common, where we plan the study ahead by looking into the Chinese market, patient recruitments, things like that. And before the global enters into the phase 3 study, China or Japan conducts a PK/PD bridging study to look at the potential ethnic difference or similarity. On the other hand, we try to prove that, so that different countries can join this global phase 3 multiple regional clinical trial, MRCT. And this is the more efficient way we can close the gap for NDA among different countries, and we can reduce the duplication of clinical trials. This is the way we try to achieve. Okay. Now we mentioned the MRCT studies. In year 2017, ICH as well as the US FDA, they jointly issued this ICH E17 guideline. The concept of MRCT, in fact, is not new. Before that, many countries were using this principle, but the issue of ICH E17 standardized the process and highlighted some of the risks, which I'm going to talk about for some of them. And like I said, the concept of MRCT is straightforward. Basically, you have different regions or different countries contributing to the MRCT study. The goals of ICH E17 are also clear. To develop an infrastructure for global drug development, to provide better evidence for drug approval in each region, and put it an easy way to say that to avoid duplication of clinical studies among different regions, so that patients in the world, different parts of the world, can have earlier access to innovative therapies. They are similar to the ICH E5 guidance. There are different options for a global development plan for joining the MRCT studies. I briefly mentioned about this option before. If normally Western companies started with the early drug development clinical trials, then at certain stage, ideally, or at the latest, phase 2, before phase 2 study finishes, China or Japan should kick off a PK/PD bridging study, so that we can join the MRCT study. This is particularly important for some of the disease. I'll give you some case studies later on, where China market or China patient, there's a huge number of Chinese patients for some of the disease areas. So we can contribute to the MRCT study. The second option is not so common, but again, this is the trend for the future, because drug development is a quite complex process. Many of the drugs have multiple potential indications, or at different stages, we will need to conduct different clinical studies. So the second option is the ideal synchronized global development plan, but obviously that requires close collaboration between different regions or different partners. If you sometimes out-license your asset to a Chinese biotech companies, you should also take the partnership, their ability to progress this asset into consideration. It's not just a deal for money, but also for real, in a sense, for drug development as well. So this slide shows the number of MRCT studies are increasing. The top half shows the MRCT studies sponsored by Chinese companies, registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And the bottom half shows the clinical studies conducted mainly in China, but also have other countries involved. You can see since year 2018, there's a big number of increase for MRCT studies. So in a sense, this illustrates the collaboration between different regions. We are seeing the trend of avoiding duplications in clinical trials. Having said so, there are a few risks that you needed to take into consideration when planning or conducting the MRCT studies. The first one is the longer process for clinical trial approval than USA and also in EU. Like I said, over the past 5 years, since the regulatory reform, there's quite an improvement for regulatory approval, but still the timeline for clinical trial approval at the moment in China is longer than other countries. One particular process is so-called HGRAC for abbreviation, which stands for Human Genetic Resource Administration of China. For foreign companies to conduct clinical trials, this process is mandatory, and it can take somewhere between 1.5 months to 1.5 months or 2 months. There are some pitfalls during that process, which is not the focus of my presentation today. On this slide, it's just to illustrate, to show that the clinical trial approval, that process can be longer in China than in other countries. So that will affect the feasibility or the overall timeline for China to join the MRCT study. There are ways to mitigate this risk. For example, by good project planning. For example, if we are aware of this delay lagging behind, but later on when we are planning the study, we know that China can catch up with the patient enrollment, then it might be still okay. So I'm going to use 3 different scenarios. The first one is if you plan the study very well and the documents are satisfactory to China FDA or NMPA, and now it is called NMPA, then the delay for IND application of clinical trial approval is minimal compared to the overall study, phase 3 study. So that's the ideal case. The second scenario is there might be some moderated delay by any of the reasons, but in comparison to the overall phase 3 study, in particular, China can compensate that delay with faster patient enrollment, then this case might still be okay. But you also needed to consider what percentage of Chinese patients can participate into the overall phase 3 study. That is the number of patients, which later on I'm going to have more details. The third one is for some reason, probably due to the poor preparation planning, or some of the documents are do not meet the regulatory requirements, then it can caught the sponsor may be caught in surprise because sometimes the NMPA will ask for a bridging study before China joining or conduct a phase 3 study. And it depends on the duration of the bridging study. It can sometimes happen, it can take 6 months, sometimes even longer if it is a patient study in patients. Then China may not be able to join the MRCT study, and a separate phase 3 study needed to be conducted. So that is the situation we try to avoid. The second risk is the dose rationale. This is the area where China FDA pays special attention to, especially over the past 10 years. Many of the global companies have their assets in late phase clinical trials or already approved in US or Europe. And when they are trying to conduct clinical trials in China, the first question they will be asked is, what about the dose rationale in Chinese patients? Whether the same dose applies to the Western population, applies to Chinese population as well. So that's why in one of the previous slides, I recommend early planning, and sometimes PK bridging study can help address this question. Although it also depends on other factors. For example, unmet medical need, efficacy and safety data from previous studies conducted in overseas, things like that. So the third bullet point here shows, later on I have a case study. If the previous data or early trial data shows there's ethnic difference in efficacy or safety, then we recommend to conduct separate phase 3 studies using different dose regimen as compared to Western populations. Here's an example. Roflumilast is a drug developed by Takeda. I think before Takeda took over, AstraZeneca was also involved in this asset. It is a PDE4 inhibitor, and in year 2011 approved by the US FDA for the treatment of severe COPD. And the approved dose was 500 microgram daily. Roflumilast, you can see the molecular structure on the right side. It has an active metabolite, roflumilast noxide. Okay, now if I go back to the previous one. So like I said, roflumilast was approved by the US FDA in year 2011. By then, there's no, before that, there's no clinical data in China. So this is a quite common 10 years ago for Chinese, for global, for a drug that is already approved in the US or Europe to enter into China. This is what we call the class 5, not just called a class 3 drug. Basically approved in overseas, but not in China by a global company. Then the typical practice is to conduct phase 1 PK study as well as a phase 3 study. So for roflumilast, this is the case because it missed the opportunity to join the global phase 3 study. So China led a regional MRCT study because for many of you that who are familiar with the history of Chinese regulatory reforms, 10 years ago, this is quite common because in order to form a multiple regional clinical trial, China and sometimes Japan, Korea, and other Asian companies will contribute to this regional trials. Now, in this case, overall phase 3 study, which is a placebo-controlled, double-blind, parallel group, multiple phase 3 study. Overall, 626 patients were enrolled, but majority of them were Chinese, contributed by so the study duration is 24 weeks. Placebo-controlled study, randomized 1-to-1 to receive either roflumilast or placebo. The primary endpoint was the change of bronchodilator FEV1 from baseline to study end, that is at 24 weeks. You can see that in terms of the efficacy and the safety, the results were quite good. So for efficacy, roflumilast met the primary endpoint. It demonstrated a sustained increase over placebo with FEV1 of 0.071. And also the 95% confidence interval is within the predefined area. The p-value is quite significant. And the adverse event profile was consistent with the previous results from overseas studies. However, its NDA or new drug application in China was rejected by then CFDA because if we look at the roflumilast label by the US FDA, there's a clear mentioning of the potential ethnic difference as compared to Caucasians, African Americans, Hispanics, and Japanese showed increased exposure for roflumilast, and it's also its active metabolite, roflumilast noxide. In China, CFDA asked for a dose rationale for phase 3 study in Chinese patients, but I think the sponsor neglected that recommendation. So the NDA of roflumilast is not approved. As a result of that, still it is roflumilast is not approved in China. I know many of the local companies tried to develop a generic drug, but because the original drug is not approved, so it's very hard for generic drugs to conduct clinical trials as well. So that's the second risk. The third risk is the regional variability and its impact on safety and efficacy. So this is a quite classic illustration of the impact of regional variability on and its impact on safety and efficacy, cited from the ICH E17 guideline. I'll mention that what's the implication for China later on, use a case study. But for this graph, you can see because as we know, many of the drugs are more efficacious for more severe disease. So here the pink one shows region 1, where most of the patients have mild to moderate degree of severity of the disease. As a result of that, you can see the response for region 1 is lower than region 2, where most of the patients have more severe disease. But a combined phase 3 study, for example, if we take phase 3 study as an example, the overall results is a combination of region 1 and region 2. So this is just for simplicity purpose. Obviously, sometimes we have multiple regions. So the overall results can be more complicated because the different regions, the regional variability can impact the overall results. So what's the implication? I'm going to use a case study, but before that, a little bit background of the disease, hepatocellular carcinoma. We know that HCC can be caused by different risk factors, as illustrated on the graph on the left. And on the right side, it shows the geographic distribution of the main risk factors for HCC worldwide. This data is outdated because that it is data before we have curable drugs for HCC. But 5 years ago, or probably a little bit more than that, before we have curable drugs for HCV, the risk factors for Europe countries and Asian countries are quite different because, as we can see here, for Europe and North America, the main risk factor is HCV. But for Asian and African countries, the main risk factor is HBV. I think this is still correct, but for Western countries, because HCV is not curable, so the number can be different. Anyway, I'm talking about 5 years ago. So if we look at these two trials, very similar design, comparison of sorafenib over placebo. On the left, this is the SHARP study conducted in Europe. On the right side, this is the ORIENTAL study conducted in China. You can see the similarity between these two graphs and also the tables. For example, sorafenib shows superiority against placebo. If we look at the overall survival and other endpoints, sorafenib group shows the superiority over the placebo. But if you look at the details, you can see the striking difference between the absolute number. For example, the overall survival in the placebo group is 7.9 months in Europe, but only 4.2 months in the ORIENTAL study from China. Okay. The reason, as I mentioned, there are different risk factors for China and for European countries. And there's another reason for medical practice reason, because unfortunately, many patients in Asian countries, including China, when they have their first diagnosis, they already had advanced disease. So that's why for the placebo group, you can see in the ORIENTAL study, the overall survival was much shorter than the SHARP study on the left. Now, here comes the implication of this difference. And we know that for nivolumab, the PD-1 developed by BMS, BMS conducted a lot of clinical studies named after CheckMate, and this particular CheckMate study 459 was a randomized multiple regional phase 3 study to compare nivolumab versus sorafenib in HCC patients. To the credit of BMS, they did take the regional difference as a stratification factor. So when during the randomization, Asian versus non-Asian was a stratification factor. Nevertheless, for the reasons I mentioned, because there's a striking difference for the HCC patients in Asian population versus Western population, it is very hard for to combine these two populations together. At least when they are calculating the sample size, the regional variability should also be taken into consideration, and the sample size should be larger than normal study. Having said so, in this study, they already recruited more than 700 patients. But if you look at their press release in June of year 2019, it has been announced that this study didn't meet the predefined threshold of statistical significance. If we look at the hazard ratio, this is 0.85, but unfortunately, the 95% of confidence interval, the top end, just missed the predefined significance, and the p-value was slightly larger than 0.05, which we typically use. So I think now this geographic regional difference could be may explain the failure of this CheckMate 459. The fourth risk is the sample size allocation. I briefly mentioned about the MRCT study. If China joins the MRCT study late, then there may not be enough patient allocation to China. So that could add the risk for NMPA to approve this particular asset in China. We know that normally for MRCT study, the same dose regimen should be used across different regions, and this is written in the ICH E17 guideline for the sample size allocation to different regions. You needed to take into consideration of disease prevalence across the regions, the patient accrual rate of different regions, and other factors. But in particular, to meet the Chinese regulatory requirements, we recommend to have somewhere between 15 to 20%, although this number is not official, of the subjects to China. So when you are planning the study, you need to consider this factor into consideration. Having said so, there are exceptions. Here's a case study we had 2 years ago. Avatrombopag, we know it's a TPO drug for the treatment of TPO, thrombocytopenia, and this is because it is a rare disease in the US, and also defined by the NMPA as a rare disease. This is the design of the phase 3 study. We have the pre-randomization phase based on the baseline platelet count. The patients can be divided into two categories. Even well, they used the baseline platelet as a stratification factor, and according to the baseline platelet counts, the patients are divided into the active treatment group and the matching placebo group. Okay, and this now, like I mentioned, typically we would recommend somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population assigned to China. But in this study, China joined the phase 3 study late, because this China right was assigned to a local Chinese company. And I guess when the deal was done, the phase 3 study probably has already started. So China joined the phase 3 study late. As a result of that, this total number of patients was 231 participants in this phase 3 study, and only 8 Chinese patients joined the phase 3 study. But it got approved by the China FDA, accepted by China FDA. You can see the approved timeline on the right side. Not only because they managed to have China participated into this phase 3 MRCT study, I think efficient communication with the NMPA is also important. And we also helped the sponsor to prepare an ethnicity sensitivity analysis report to convince NMPA that the same dose is applicable to the Chinese patients. On the other hand, another similar product wasn't so lucky, the situation was quite similar. This drug was approved in the US, and then the China right has been sold to a China biotech company. But by then, the drug was already approved by the US FDA. So basically, this biotech company in China missed the boat to participate into this global phase 3 study. And they have to conduct a phase 3 study. Like I said, this is a rare disease. And in the previous slide, I showed that the global study took almost 3 years to complete. So in this case, I would say, it's quite unfortunate for the second case, where they have to spend another 3 years and on their own cost to conduct a separate phase 3 study. So the lessons learned from this is we will try to involve China into global phase 3 study if possible. At least when you are planning the development strategy, you need to take that into consideration. And it's particularly important for rare disease, because for different reasons. One being, as I use the avatrombopag as an example, for rare disease, it is always you can always negotiate with the regulatory body. The other thing is for rare disease, because of the large patient population, in fact, some of the rare disease, if you look at the absolute number, it's not so rare in China. So having China involved in phase 3 study could greatly improve the patient recruitment rate, therefore to shorten the phase 3 study duration. And the third lesson is, if possible, try to allocate somewhere between 15 to 20% of the subjects to China, but there are some flexibility. Proactive communication with the NMPA is always encouraged. So to conclude, over the past 5 years, the NMPA, previously known as CFDA, had made significant reforms in addressing critical gaps, especially after CFDA joined ICH in year 2016. And after that, we basically, China used the international technical standards guidelines to promote the quality for clinical trials. Now, I hope with my presentation today, I have convinced you to include China into the MRCT study, at least to include into your planning. So you look at the pros and cons of this and that strategy. I believe that could increase the efficiency of drug development. But there are some risks to take into consideration when you are planning the studies and conducting studies. In particular, potential ethnic difference. You need to address that from data, from theoretical background, or try to convince the regulatory body with the efficacy and safety data that is already available from overseas data. Finally, this won't take long, but roughly it will take about 3 minutes for me to briefly introduce TigerMed and why I think we are the right partner when you are planning to conduct clinical studies in China. Overall, we have more than 7,000 employees in China and global wise. Over the past 15 years, we had almost 2,000 global customers. We have offices in different regions and different countries, and we supported a lot of 43 may not sound a lot to our European customers or US customers, but because the new drug development, especially class 1 innovative drugs, are quite new in China. So 43, I would say, account for quite a big chunk of class 1 innovative drugs in China. Yeah. So we provide end-to-end clinical services from regulatory affairs, IND application, clinical trial application, operation, biometrics, that's data management, statistics, PK/PD modeling, to post-marketing real-world evidence. We also provide services to medical devices. This is our presence in China. As Stella mentioned, TigerMed is the leading clinical CRO in China. So essentially, we have a presence in almost all the main cities across China. We also have global footprints in the US, in Korea, in Japan, and in India, in Switzerland, like Stella is based in Switzerland. We also have Opera based in Romania. Okay, so like I said, we over the past since year 2004, we've supported the launch of 43 class 1 innovative drugs in China, sponsored by Chinese companies. Like I said, we supported a lot of global pharma and global biotech companies to enter the China market by conducting clinical trials here, and we supported a lot of NDA, new drug application, or for biologics as well. So you can see, although the number for small molecules is more than biologics, we are seeing an increased trend for biologics. So this is similar the trend globally. And if we divide these projects into different disease areas, this is the pie chart for different disease areas, particularly oncology areas. I think the trend is similar global wise. if we divided the therapeutic areas, a different way to illustrate that, this one shows the number of projects, and on the right side, the projects by different phase 3 studies. So I would say 3 years ago, 5 years ago, TigerMed are involved in many larger scaled clinical studies. But with the globalization and also with the surge of local biotech companies, we think we are also putting an emphasis on early stage clinical trials. Personally, I think early clinical studies is more challenging than some of the phase 3 studies, because you needed to take into consideration of preclinical data, and the early clinical studies are more flexible. It's because for the exploratory nature of these trials. With that, I thank you for your attention. If you can always contact Stella, who's based in Zug, Switzerland. I believe we have some time for question and answers. Stella?
Thank you so much, Jinsong. Thank you for your presentation. Well, if you ask me, it was an evident display of your knowledge on the topics. So let's give Jinsong a round of digital applause.
Thank you, digital applause. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I think now we go to the Q&A session. Let me open this box. So we do it according to, let's see, the first one. So Jinsong, the first one who asked you the question from an anonymous attendee, he or she asked, I'm wondering the timeline for HGRAC approval timeline. Is it true we can get approval within 2 months? What is the industry experience? 2 to 6 months? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in particularly, HGRAC is a relatively new concept. I think
HGRAC, sorry.
Yeah, HGRAC. Okay, what we call. It's quite new. It only happened 2 or 3 years ago, and to be honest, over the past 2 or 3 years, we had a lot of hiccups while interacting with the agency. But since then, some of the guidelines are getting more and more clear, and we have accumulated quite a lot of experience in terms of preparing the documents. For example, some of it is especially for early clinical trials, exploratory pharmacodynamic endpoints are quite common for overseas or in Europe studies or US studies, but because potential exploratory endpoints will enter into this area of so-called human genetic information, so it can be sensitive. So how to make this clear and interact with the agency, it's important. In our experience, 2 months is a typical time, but sometimes, unfortunately, there are cases we can get the application kicked back from the agency, and that could lead to a longer time.
Thank you, Jinsong. I just want to add a little bit of comments on HGRAC. So we have a statistical, compared to industry, pass-through rate. So the average in China in 2020, the pass-through rate by HGRAC is about 75%. And by TigerMed, it's about 85%. So yeah, that's the figure.
Thank you, Stella.
Thank you, Jinsong. So I think the second question goes to our RA colleagues, Jing Yan. Jing Yan, can you, yes, please. Jing Yan, the question is about pre-IND meeting. So for a biological product that already obtained marketing authorization in EU in 2017, now this company is intend to go to China. So he asked, do we need to apply for a pre-IND meeting or CTA directly? Jing Yan, please.
Jing Yan, you are on mute.
Can you open your microphone, please? Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, firstly, thanks for the audience question. This is Jing Yan from RA Department of TigerMite. Regarding your questions, to be straightforward, the answer is it is not mandatory to have a pre-IND meeting before CTA. So you could directly submit CTA to CDE in such case. And I'd like to elaborate more about the meeting related regulations. Actually, according to the regulations in China, only for the drugs who are seeking for conditional approval or the priority review, it is mandatory to have meeting with CDE. And then in principle, CDE requires the sponsor to have pre-IND only for first in human study or the BLA to be submitted to CDE. So this is for your reference. Thank you.
Yeah, Jing Yan, thank you for the explanation. I would like to add a little bit more. Like Jing Yan mentioned, if the drug is already approved in EU, you don't need to go through the pre-IND. It's not mandatory in China. You can go for the IND application directly. But sometimes it's maybe worthwhile to have a pre-IND meeting, particularly if it is, for example, for rare disease, for multiple indications, then you would like to discuss with NMPA with, for example, what type of studies you can, whether you can reduce the study or avoid the study, or it is for multiple disease areas. Can you just conduct one of them and things like that? It's worthwhile to discuss with the NMPA. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jing Yan.
Thank you for, yeah.
So the next question is from Christoph. Christoph asked, it's a very interesting question. So what is the acceptance by CDE of clinical studies conducted in overseas Chinese population patients from Australia or Canada instead? Can that be used as a phase 3 study towards CDE? And also the same question applied to the PK and PD studies. So phase 3 and PK, PD. Can they use overseas Chinese population?
Okay, so if it is for
example, Australia or Canada.
Okay, so if it is for phase 3 study, there's in that phase 3 study, Chinese origin patients living in Australia or Canada participated into that study. The data is, the answer is no. The phase 3 study must have Chinese patients living in China involved. I think it's almost 99%. The answer is no. Having said so, if it is Christopher also asked the question about the PK/PD studies. If it is early clinical studies in terms of PK/PD relationship, if you have Asian population in phase 1 study or phase 2 studies, then the data is acceptable because the purpose is to illustrate whether there's ethnic difference or not. The principle can be used, but sometimes even even that, when you are conducting, you may not be able to jump onto a phase 3 study directly because sometimes bridging study is required. But you are right. Sometimes the data, the PK/PD data conducted in overseas Asian population or Chinese patients are acceptable as a PK/PD results. So you can, if you can provide enough evidence to show there's no PK exposure difference, and also the safety profile, efficacy data are quite similar to Western population, then there's a possibility to for China to join the phase 3 MRCT study straight away.
Thank you, Jinsong. I think Jingyan want to add more comments on that. For I think Jingyan had the outline mentioned there's exceptions.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
More comments on that? The first question from Christoph.
Yes, thank you, Jinsong and Stella. Yeah, this is Jingyan again. Yes, I'd like to supplement some exceptions. That is, as Jinsong has mentioned in the answer to question 2, if the drug is indicated for rare disease or the drug has been included into the clinically unmet needs in China list, then in such case, we have chance to directly use overseas data to seeking for NDA approval in China, and after communication with CDE by proving that there is no ethics difference. In such case, we have chance, but PMS, the post-marketing study has to be done in such case, and after NDA approval. So this is for your information. If the indication is rare disease, but the rare disease must be listed into China rare disease list, or if the drug is the clinically unmet in China and included into the special list in China. So we have chance to use overseas data to directly apply for NDA.
Thank you, Jingyan. Thank you, Jinsong. Thank you. So next one is also a question for safety. The question is there a specific requirement on safety exposure? Do we still have to follow the previous guideline on safety exposure requirement, i.e. biologicals 300 subjects and small molecule 100 subjects?
So I'll start with this and see Jingyan can correct me or add more information. The answer is no. This requirement of 300 subjects for biologics and I think it's 200 for small molecules is no longer applicable. So like I said, since China joined the ICH, we are on the trend to adopt international standards, and with that, basically, we are getting more and more scientifically based. The sample size is based on medical practice, the efficacy of the drug in comparison to placebo or active control, and also the variation of that. It's not just a fixed number anymore.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just looking at the screen. Okay, thank you so much. The next question is for rare diseases, Jinsong. I think it's here. So for rare diseases, does POP PK in phase 2 or phase 3 data replace to a routine PK bridge study in China?
So we are talking about two things. One is the application of POP PK. I would say, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, there's the NMPA accepts the method of population PK, not only just for rare disease, but almost for every disease, oncology drugs, non-oncology drugs. In phase 2 and phase 3 studies, we are applying population PK type of approach. In terms of the bridging study, I guess this question was talking about when you have pop PK data in phase 2 or phase 3 study conducted for example, in US or Europe, then would the NMPA accepts the data as long as that it shows there's no ethnic difference. I know pop PK can provide that kind of information if we have enough number of Asian population in the study, then we can prove that this is acceptable. But having said so, if it is already phase 3 study, then there's no chance for China to join the phase 3 study. I would say if it is from a phase 2 study population data, we analyze it and having China to join the phase 3 study without a separate bridging study, that is possible.
Thank you, Jinsong.
Okay.
Thank you. I think let's see. Let's answer 2 more questions, Jinsong. The next question is for monoclonal antibodies. Do you have any case showing a positive ethnicity differences between Asia and Caucasian?
I would say the answer is quite rare, not that common, but there are a few examples. I can give 2 examples. One is we know for monoclonal antibodies, one of the factors affecting its exposure is body weight. And typically Asian subjects have lower body weight than Western subjects, which often leads to higher exposure in Asian population. And having said so, it's not always a problem. 20% increase of exposure for monoclonal antibodies, because most of them are antagonists. As long as the safety profile is okay, efficacy data is similar, 20% difference caused by body weight difference is acceptable. That is fine. But you need a lot of explanation, like we discussed the population PK analysis to convince the NMPA. The second example is I don't remember the exact the name of the drug, but theoretically I can give you this example. For some of we know for antibodies, they have specific targets, and this happens for some of the disease in where in the HCC case, for example, I give often in China, many of the patients in their initial diagnosis, the disease they already have advanced the disease. And because of that, they basically have higher disease burden, and that could affect the PK exposure. They may have accelerated clearance of the drug in those patients have higher disease burden. So that may cause some difference. But as long as these kind of factors can we can take these factors into consideration, and we have reasonable explanations. Most of the cases are okay.
Thank you, Jinzong. So, should we go to the last question due to the time limit? Okay. I think last question is related to the previous question. So the colleague said, I agree the overseas Chinese PK/PD data may support China directly join global phase 3 MRCT. Can the overseas Chinese PK/PD data substitute China mainland PK/PD data for NDA submission?
Okay, yeah, theoretically, the answer is yes, but we haven't seen many cases where in early clinical studies conducted overseas, we've seen a lot of Chinese subjects. Often we see 1 or 2 subjects, I would say less than 10, including some of the Asian population. Then that will be very difficult to convince an MPA to waive a bridging study in China. But theoretically, yes.
Thank you, Jinsong. I think I saw another question popping. Let's answer the question. Okay. So the next one is for rare diseases and oncology study. Can a routine PK bridging study parallel with phase 3 in China due to unmet medical needs?
Yeah, so thank you for the audience for those interesting questions, and this one is also quite common. Now, I would say in practice, the answer is yes, because like Jingyan mentioned, for rare disease and other disease with the huge unmet medical needs, if you can show the preliminary efficacy and safety data obtained from overseas studies, then sometimes you don't even need the PK bridging study in China. So in practice, the answer is yes, but in theory, I would say to conduct a PK bridging study in parallel phase 3 study, it's really a waste of. It's just for box ticking, really, to show we have this data, but the data didn't have any impact on phase 3 study, because the purpose of bridging study is to see whether Chinese patients the same dose applies to Chinese patients or not. And if you conduct the PK bridging study in parallel with the phase 3 study, the results of that study will not have any impact for the phase 3 study. But I know this still happens a lot in practice.
Thank you so much, Jinsong. Thank you. So I think we thank you, everyone. We, of course, first of all, we thank Jinsong and Jingyan for the excellent answers to the questions, for the presentation, very interesting presentation. And we want to say that if you want to keep learning about China pharmaceutical market and drug development, and don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn in TigerMed account. And we will regularly share knowledge and insights into the current trends and the regulations that will keep you into the China market or conduct clinical trials in China. So again, contact us if you have additional questions. We're happy to answer your questions and can arrange TCs, etc. We're saying that thank you all again for your interest, for your participation, for the great questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a good evening, have a good afternoon, and a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.